Heather Elwood is a native and lifelong resident of Logan, Utah. She can trace her fascination with plants back to planting the family garden and learning about photosynthesis from her grandpa. A childhood dream of working at Dinosaur National Monument was fulfilled during her graduate work at USU. Though, instead of digging up dinosaur bones, she researched ways to better manage the invasive grass downy brome in western rangelands. If anyone is looking to give her a Christmas or birthday or a just because present, she would love to add a maidenhair fern to her plant collection. And her lecture is titled Plants, the Good, the Bad, the Myths. Everyone applaud.
There we go. Okay, so perhaps myths is not quite accurate. Maybe stories or folklore associated with some plants. So the first one we're going to talk about is Johnny Appleseed. And because I love Johnny Appleseed and I love Stephen Kellogg's version of Johnny Appleseed, I'm going to read you a story.
Other than the napkin fold. Because that's intense. Was really great. That's a life skill. Take that to the bake.
Okay. John Chapman, who later became known as Johnny Appleseed, was born on September 26, 1774, when the apples on the trees surrounding his home in Leominster, Massachusetts, were as red as the autumn leaves. John's first years were hard. His father left the family to fight in the Revolutionary War, and his mother and his baby brother both died before his second birthday. I have to show you the illustrations, because that's why I love this book. So, by the time John turned 6, his father had remarried and settled in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children. Nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and used them to make sauces, cider, vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into the glowing fruit of autumn. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all of nature. He often escaped from his boisterous household to the tranquil woods. The animals sensed his gentleness and trusted him. As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and planted a small orchard with the pouch of apple seeds he carried with him. Here's a picture. John walked hundreds of miles through the Pennsylvania forest, living like the Indians he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apple trees. When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. On clear nights, he stretched out under the stars. Over the next few years, John continued to visit and care for his new orchards. The winters slowed him down, but he survived happily on a diet of butternuts.
That's a pretty boring diet.
After this butternuts.
One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. They were amazed to hear that John wouldn't hurt an animal and had no use for a gun. They challenged John to compete at wrestling, the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree-chopping match. The woodsman eagerly agreed. There's the tree-chopping match.
Oh my goodness.
That's intense. When the sawdust settled, there was no question about who could come out on top. John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been cleared so quickly. He thanked the exhausted woodsmen for their help and began planting. During the next few years, John continued to move westward. Whenever he ran out of apple seeds, he hiked to the eastern cider presses to replenish his supply. Before long, John's plantings were spread across the state of Ohio. Meanwhile, the pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchards on the routes he thought they'd be traveling. As he had hoped, the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to his new neighbors. Often he would give his trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and stories from the Bible. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans. The settlers feared that the Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other, but when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night, shouting a warning at every door. After the war, people urged Johnny to build a house and settle down. He replied that he lived like a king in his wilderness home, and he returned to the forest he loved. During his long absences, folks enjoyed sharing their recollections of Johnny. They retold his stories, and sometimes they even exaggerated them a bit. Some recall Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock and chatting with the birds. Others remember that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot. Fortunately, Johnny's feet were as tough as elephant's hide, so that things didn't penetrate. It was said that Johnny had once tended a wounded wolf and then kept him for a pet. An old hunter swore he'd seen Johnny frolicking with the bear family. The storytellers outdid each other with tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness.
Everyone knows bears frolic.
He's frolicking.
Here's some more of the tales surrounding Johnny Appleseed.
Well, that's a big wow.
Right?
Those are some big apples.
I know. As the years passed, Ohio became too crowded for Johnny. He moved to the wilds of Indiana, where he continued to clear the land for his orchards. When the settlers began arriving, Johnny recognized some of the children who had listened to his stories. Now they had children of their own. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. Curiously, Johnny's stories continued to move westward without him. Folks maintained that they'd seen him in Illinois or that he'd greeted them in Missouri, Arkansas, or Texas. Others were certain that he'd planted trees on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains or in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim they've seen Johnny Appleseed. I don't know what you remembered about learning about Johnny Appleseed in elementary school, but those were the things I remembered, that he planted all of these orchards, right? And that there were still orchards today that he had planted that you could eat apples from. And really that's the myth I want to address with Johnny Appleseed. So.
Did he wear a pan on his head?
Whether he wore a pan on his head and wore a burlap sack, I don't know. That will just be a mystery.
Part of it.
But, yeah, we can say that he did. It makes it more picturesque, I suppose. So before we talk about some of those myths with the orchards he planted, we'll talk about first where apples came from and just some other things about them. So, apples, you've probably heard the saying that's American is apple pie, right? That's the saying, right? Apples, the only native apples to the United States are crab apples, and no one is going to be wanting to put them in a pie. The apples that we think of are actually from Kazakhstan, and they have a lot of variety of apples there. Malus domestica is probably the one that we think of, the domestic apple. And because the silk route went through there, the apples were probably spread along the silk route. And they hybridize really readily with other apples, and so along the way they're always changing and adapting, being able to adapt to new places. But a lot of those apples that were produced were unpalatable, very tart, not really good for eating like the apples we think of today. And that was the case until crafting was invented by the Chinese. And this is continued today with apples, well, most fruit trees, actually, because fruit trees, especially apples and pears, I guess anything in that home family, they don't reproduce true to seed or true to type. So, if you think of an apple, you've probably all cut open an apple this way and seen the 5 segments, right? The nice pentagram. Side note, there's a lot of cool math with plants and just different patterns in plants. If you want an introduction to that, you should check out Math Magic with Donald Duck. Great. Anyway, it talks about really cool ratios and patterns. But in the apple, it has the 5 sections, and in each of those chambers will be 1 to 2 seeds in them. Each of those seeds will produce a different apple tree. So there's a lot of genetic diversity that can happen with those apples. And so you find a nice apple that tastes good, you decide, okay, I want to plant some of this. You're not going to get that same apple from its seeds. It's going to resemble it, but it's not going to be the same. So, grafting, that's why they graft. They find a rootstock that does well in that area, and then you'll take a branch from the tree that has the good apples that you want, and you'll graft that onto it. That way, it will be able to survive in different areas, maybe that are colder or warmer, but it's going to be producing that same kind of apple, and you're not going to have all of that diversity. So that's the first thing with Johnny Appleseed and the orchards. He was planting them from seeds, which means there were going to be a lot of different kinds of apples. So if you go back east, like I ran into this a lot, oh yeah, this orchard was planted by Johnny Appleseed. Probably not, because these are all the same type of apple that are in here. That wasn't going to happen from the seeds. And also, he was planting them along the westward movement of the frontier. He knew that people were moving west, and he wanted to provide them with apple trees. Part of the reason is because cider was the big drink of choice. Not a lot of clean water. They didn't have really good wine grapes, and so they would pick the apples and make cider out of them. Also, I think as part of claiming a piece of land, you needed to have so many apple trees on it, because that gave it a sense of permanence. And so he knew that people were moving west, would be needing to buy fruit trees for both food and just to meet the requirements, and so he planted his orchards there along the westward frontier.
So even at this time, the apples weren't really good to eat.
No.
They were mainly for juices.
So when first American immigrants, I guess, came over, they brought some trees with them from England or the old world, but they didn't do really well because they weren't adapted to the conditions here. They were able to hybridize with some of the native crab apples and then be able to cultivate them that way for apples that were good here. So you could get good eating apples, but most of the orchards that people had, it was just a really big variety. Most of them were made into cider. Even at Johnny Appleseed's time. Especially because he was also, he was along the frontier, so, yeah.
So does Malus domestica cover any of the varieties of edible apples, or is it a specific variety?
So now all of the varieties of apples you see will be the Malus, is the genus, and then we'll probably have an X and then another species name. Because they'll all be hybrids of different things. But this is kind of like the grandfather of the domesticated apples.
Is there a current variety that's closest to that, or is that hard to say?
I don't know. Probably not on the market.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I really don't know.
Kazakhstan.
You might have to go to Kazakhstan. Road trip! So, that's, really the myth with Johnny Appleseed is that just there's a lot of variety with apples when you plant them.
My childhood is ruined.
I know, right? But an apple a day keeps the doctor away. You've all heard that, right? So, do you think that's really true? I don't know. If you just ate apples, I think you'd have some other health problems. But I think it's good, eat plants, right? But, thinking about some other apples in history, over here, we've got a picture of some temperance movement. So they didn't really like the apples because of the hard cider. So some people think that the apple a day keeps the doctor away. slogan came up after that movement to try and give apples a better picture. I don't know if people say it was from before then. The Bible doesn't say what the forbidden fruit was Adam and Eve ate, but a lot of art, it often is depicted as an apple tree. So, I don't know, the reason I guess we need doctors is because we had apples in the first place, so maybe it doesn't keep the doctor away. But if you ask Snow White, I mean, that was a poison apple, right? That wasn't good for her. So, apples have kind of had a bad rap throughout history. But, like I said before, I mean, it's fruit and vegetables. We need them. And eating plants is not only good preventative medicine, but it's good treatment as well. Whether you subscribe to essential oils and herbal remedies or not, most of the, if not all, of the medications are plant-based to begin with. For example, digitalis, which is for regulating heart problems, so regulating your heart rhythm, comes from the plant foxglove, which you can plant in your garden. Taxol, which is a cancer drug, comes from a yew bush, which there are plenty around Logan. But that being said, don't just go out and start eating random plants. If you were to eat digitalis just by it, or the foxglove, it could kill you. If you were to eat yew just by itself, that would also probably kill you. So, science is really great in being able to take the good parts of plants and being able to put them to good use. So, we'll move on to the next one I wanted to talk about. What does that have to do with Braveheart? Anyone thought about this?
The painting of the face?
Yes. So, blue dye. I've never seen Braveheart. I really don't know what the story is. I know that warriors in old northern Britain often painted themselves this blue color, which came from Dyer's Woad. Anyone who's lived in Utah probably knows Dyer's Woad, right? It's probably one of the weeds that you've heard of, or at least would recognize. If you're driving through Sardine Canyon in the springtime, all of the yellow flowers, it's Dyer's Woad. So it's native to Eurasia, which it's a big area. It includes all of Europe and Asia. It was introduced into the U.S. To use as a dye crop, but then has spread further through contaminated seed and then other just escaped cultivation. It's a member of the mustard family. Other members of that family are things like broccoli and cauliflower. So those are all mustards. And this plant, it's interesting because it can have an annual, a biennial, or a perennial life cycle, which makes it difficult to control. So annuals, they'll complete their life cycle from seed until reproducing seed and dying in 1 year. A biennial, it will take 2 years to complete that cycle, and a perennial can just keep on living and living. So Dyer's Woad can, depending on the situation, could have any of those 3 life cycles. So yeah, you'll recognize it for the yellow flowers in the springtime, and then the dark black seeds later on in the fall. Produces a lot of seeds, so that's one way it gets around. But, like I said, it was first cultivated for dye. The chemical is indigotine. It's found in the leaves, not the seeds, which you might think of because they're that dark blue color. But they would pick the leaves, crush them, form them into these little balls, and then dry them. And then when they needed to make the dye, or I guess later on, they would take those dried balls, put them in a big vat like that, and then ferment them. Add water, urine, other things, and ferment them for a month, and then they would dry it again until it was needed as a dye. And then they would add it to water and dye their clothing or paint their bodies for warriors. But when indigo became more available, and then later synthetic indigo was made, then making dye from Dyer's Woad just fell out of practice. So that's why we don't have it today. But, if you really wanted to make some indigo dye from dyers, well, we've got plenty around. Because, like I said, it was introduced into the United States during colonial times. It was first documented in Utah in 1917, though people speculate that it was brought here by pioneers, and they were cultivating it and escaped maybe from their garden. The reason it's a problem as a weed is because of its allelopathy, meaning it can secrete chemicals into the soil which will suppress growth of other plants around it. So it's inhibiting growth of the more desirable native plants, and then it's not palatable. So on the rangelands, your grazing animals won't eat it. So it reduces forage capacity. So that's an example of a weed that was first cultivated and now is cursed. But sometimes things can go the other way, from cursed to cultivated. One example is Cyperus esculentus, or yellow nutsedge. It's listed as one of the worst agronomic weeds worldwide, but it's cultivated in Spain now, and they use it to make a drink similar to horchata. They call it chufi. I brought some for your tasting pleasures. We can try it now, or we could just wait until we're done, either way.
Refreshments?
With refreshments,
Sure.
yeah. So there they call earth almond, or tiger nuts, or chufa sedge. And yeah, they make it into a drink. So there's lots of accounts of people trying to look for the good side of weeds. And you could eat your dandelions, make salad, or you can make chufi out of yellow nutsedge. And I couldn't talk about plants at this lecture in Christmas time without talking about poinsettias. La Flor de la Nochebuena is what it's called in Mexico. It has a lot of other names. It's Euphorbia pulcherrima is its scientific name. It's native to Mexico and Central America. It was introduced into the United States. So this is an example of an plant introduction that didn't become a weed. There are fairly few cases of that happening. But Joel Poinsett, who was the first ambassador to Mexico, who was down there, really liked it, so we brought it back in 1825. It can be a small tree to a large shrub, 12 to 15 feet tall. And the red, brightly colored part that everybody thinks that's a nice flower, those are actually modified leaves. They're called bracts. So one of its name is flame leaf or painted leaf because it doesn't look like a normal leaf. It's red instead of green. The flowers are actually these tiny little yellow things down in the middle. So yeah, it has some other names. Christmas star, crown of the Andes, lobster plant, because of the red color.
How does the redness affect its photosynthesis? Or does it?
So the plants you see at Christmas time, they're grown to be in the house, so really compact. While it's growing and establishing, those are going to be green. It won't change into that red color until it gets a certain number of certain hours of darkness. So it has to have a dark treatment, no light, or else it will interrupt that changing from photosynthetic material into the colored material. One time, so at the greenhouse, for the teaching greenhouse on campus, we would grow these as part of the class, and then they sell them. They were getting light, was coming in from the street light or something, and it kept messing it up. So one year they didn't have Christmas poinsettias. They didn't turn red until around Valentine's Day. And no one wanted to buy Valentine's poinsettias. So that was a bust that year.
So they don't do any photosynthesis when they're red?
As red, no.
Are there any of the plants that would do something similar to that? That would change color if
bracts?
we... Yeah.
Oh, with like forcing it to change color.
Mm-hmm.
Changing color, I can't think of any. There's a lot of plants that need certain that have to meet certain light requirements and temperature requirements to flower. But I can't think of any other examples of changing colors.
So
well, I guess leaves in the fall.
Oh.
So it's because the temperature changes.
So
and light
it's a
changes.
similar thing to the leaves turning brown? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
have a question.
Uh-huh.
Is it true, like, that when the leaves change color on trees or the plant, that the pigments are actually going back into the plant?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So
it's not like it's the green. Is it chlorophyll?
So yeah, the chlorophyll is deactivating. And so the other pigments that are in there are just showing through. So the other anthocyanins, the reds and the oranges and the yellows.
Well, is it those same chlorophylls that will... No, I guess it's a new leaf that grows.
It's a new leaf that grows, yeah.
But it's not in the stem of the tree? Or like the... Like
so
the branches?
chlorophylls...
The chlorophylls like go into the branch and then into the leaf?
Think about this. I haven't thought about photosynthesis for a while. So
it's okay. It's
no.
not important.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to answer that because I don't know if I'm going to answer it correctly. But yeah.
Good question.
That's a good question. One of the myths with poinsettias is that they're poisonous. Right? You probably heard, don't let your children or your pets eat the poinsettias at Christmas time because they could die. Well, that's false. They could get a stomachache if they ate multiple plants, like poinsettias, but
Stop that anyway. Let him go on. He's got like 12 more plants.
probably the bigger problem with poinsettias and other members of this family is it does have that milky sap, that latex, and that can, if you have really sensitive skin, can cause skin allergies. But there are some dangerous houseplants that you should be aware of. Things with really nice names like peace lily or Swiss cheese plant. This is one of my favorites, the ZZ plant. And then dumb cane. All of these plants, they have a lot of calcium oxalates in them, which can do a lot of damage. I'm not going to go into chemistry with that. But basically the first symptoms will be like numbness of your mouth. Dumb cane, because it will like paralyze your vocal cords, so you won't be able to speak. So
Does it
don't
last a long
eat
time?
these ones.
Or will it go away?
Well, I mean, depends on the dose. So, my experience with it
No, I miss
was
my sister.
probably shouldn't mess with that. It could also like cause kidney damage. So,
A little bit more serious.
but no, I was working at a botanical garden in Pennsylvania, and I was doing some maintenance. And it wasn't a Swiss cheese plant, but it was one similar to that. I had to cut off some of the leaves. I mean, I got some of the sap on my hands. I didn't think about it. I just kind of brushed my mouth. My lips are going numb. That's really weird. So, it really does happen. Don't eat them. So.
I'm like
Candace. Story goes along with the poinsettias. Is that symmetry? I started the story and I ended the story. Also, I love Tommy Pola, another excellent children's book. So, this is a myth or story that talks about how we got the poinsettias. Lucila lived in a small village high up in the mountains of Mexico with her mama, her papa, and her younger brother and sister Paco and Lupe. Papa worked in the fields with their burro, Pepito. Every evening, Lucila fed Pepito, gave him water, and filled his stall with clean straw. At home, Lucila helped Mama clean their casita, their little house, and pat out the tortillas for their meals. She took care of Paco and Lupe, and each evening they went to the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe near the front gate to see if fresh candles were needed. But every day was not work. On Sundays, the family went to San Gabriel in the square where Padre Alvarez said the Mass. And all through the year there were fiestas and holy days, which always began with a procession that wound through the village and ended in San Gabriel. One day, close to Christmas, La Navidad, Padre Alvarez came to their casita. Ah, Senora Martinez, buenos dias, good day, Padre Alvarez said. I am here to ask you about the blanket which covers the figure of the baby Jesus in the Christmas procession. We have used the same one for so many years that it is almost worn out. Because your weaving is so fine, I have come to ask if you would make a new one. Mi padre, Lucila's mother said, I would be honored, and Lucila will help me. On Saturday, Lucila and Mama went to the market to buy the wool for the blanket. They chose the finest yarn they could find. At home, Lucida helped Mama dye the wool the colors of the rainbow. Those colors will shine throughout the church, Papa said as he watched Lucida and Mama string the yarn on the loom. As Christmas drew closer, everyone in the village was busy. All the mamas were making gifts to place at the manger of the baby Jesus in the church. The papas worked together, putting up the manger scene in San Gabriel. Lucida and the other children went to the church for singing practice for the Christmas Eve procession, when everyone would walk to San Gabriel, singing and carrying candles. Once inside, Padre Alvarez would lay the figure of the baby Jesus in the manger, and the villagers would go up and place their gifts around it. Our gift will be the blanket for the baby Jesus, Lucida told her friends. I am helping Mama weave it. One afternoon, a few days before Christmas Eve, Lucida and the children were singing in the church when Senora Gomez came hurrying in. Lucida, you must come home. Your Mama is sick, and your Papa has taken her down to the town to see the doctor. You must take care of your brother and sister until your Papa returns tonight. Lucida was frightened. Mama had never been sick before. When she got home, Papa and Lupe were crying. They were frightened too. Lucida tried to comfort them. She made some food and sat down to wait for Papa. That evening, Papa came in looking tired and worried. He drew Lucida close and said, Lucida, mi niña, your Mama is ill. Your aunt, Tia Carmen, will take care of Mama until she is well, but I must go back and stay with Mama until I can bring her home. But it won't be until after Christmas. Senora Gomez will take care of you and Paco and Lupe while I am gone. She will come for you tomorrow. The next afternoon, Lucida overheard two women talking. Lucida's Mama is ill. She won't be able to finish the blanket for the procession. Isn't it a shame? See, the other woman said, we are also disappointed. Padre Alvarez will have to use the old, worn-out one. When Lucida went home to feed Pepito and get clothes for Paco, Lupe, and herself, she looked at the unfinished blanket on the loom. Perhaps I can finish it, she thought. But when she sat down and tried to weave, the yarn got tangled. The more she tried to untangle it, the worse it got. It was no use. She could never finish it by herself. She took the unfinished blanket to Senora Gomez. Oh, Lucida, it is so tangled. There isn't time for me to fix it, Senora Gomez told her. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. Lucida started to cry. It was her fault the blanket was ruined. Her family wouldn't have a gift to place at the manger of the baby Jesus. Don't worry, Lucida. We will all go to the procession together. Lucida didn't say anything, but in her heart she felt that she had ruined Christmas. Come, Paco, come, Lupe. It is time to go to the procession, Senora Gomez called on Christmas Eve. Where is Lucida? She was nowhere to be found. Lucida was hiding. From the shadows, Lucida watched everyone gather for the procession. The candles were lit, the singing began, and the villagers walked to San Gabriel, carrying gifts to place at the manger. Lucida walked along in the darkness and watched the procession go into the church, followed by Padre Alvarez carrying the baby Jesus. Little girl, are you Lucida? An old woman stood in the shadows nearby. Si, Lucida answered, wondering who she was. I have a message for you. Your Mama is going to be fine, and your Papa will bring her home soon, so you don't have to worry. Go now into the church and celebrate Christmas with the others. Paco and Lupe are waiting for you. I can't, Lucida told her. I don't have a gift for the baby Jesus. Mama and I were weaving a beautiful blanket, but I couldn't finish it. I tried, but I only tangled it all up. Ah, Lucida, any gift is beautiful because it is given, the old woman told her. Whatever you give, the baby Jesus will love because it comes from you. But what can I give now, Lucida said, looking around. A patch of tall green weeds grew in a tangle nearby. Lucida rushed over and picked an armful. Do you think these will be all right? Lucida turned to ask the old woman, but she was gone. Lucida walked into the church. It was blazing with candlelight, and the children were singing as she walked quietly down the aisle with a bundle of green weeds in her arms. What is Lucida carrying? A woman whispered. Why is she bringing weeds into the church? Another one murmured. Lucida reached the manger scene. She placed the green weeds around the stable. Then she lowered her head and prayed. A hush fell over the church. Voices began to whisper. Look at the weeds. Lucida opened her eyes and looked up. Each weed was tipped with a flaming red star. The manger glowed and shimmered as if lit by 100 candles. When everyone went outside after the Mass, all the clumps of tall green weeds throughout the town were shining with red stars. Lucida's simple gift had indeed become beautiful. And every Christmas to this day, the red stars shine on top of green branches in Mexico. The people call the plants La Flor de Nochebuena, the flower of the Holy Night, the poinsettia. The end. Does anyone have any houseplant questions that I can answer? Any weeds they want identified?
How do I get rid of my dandelions?
Your dandelions? You should eat them.
Oh.
It's salad.
2,4-D
is good for dandelions.
2,4-D.
Yeah.
Even in your lawn?
You could. Oh yeah. You could dig them up.
That's what he does.
Just keep coming back.
But you'd have to dig up like lots of
There's
sugar.
just so many of them here in Utah.
That's why I would say 2,4-D. Because it'll leave the
Dig
grass
up
but
your
kill the
neighbor's
dandelions.
ones.
Sure do.
Anything else? If you want to go try some weed drink.
Let's go try some weed.
Not that kind of weed. I study weeds.
All right.
That's funny too.
Well, another round of applause to both of the contenders. I think they both did an excellent job. Thank you very much for your preparation.